Welcome to Spitting Image Zoom Live. I'm your host, Ron Levi. This show is an eclectic mix of interviews, tips, and observations of genetic genealogists and wrenching stories of foundlings and adoptees who are in the process of finding or who have successfully found their biological families. It's a whodunit of people who actually did it. It's reaching out, reaching back, lifting up, and moving forward together. It's a celebration of our history, the accomplishments of our ancestors, and a love letter to our Maker from whom all blessings flow. Welcome to Spitting Image Zoom Live. Let's sizzle. So thank you all so much for joining. I'm waiting for a guest to join. We are expecting today Jackie Holmes, one of my cousins who is featured in the book. So I'm getting a little bit of feedback. As I speak to you, I'm hearing my own voice back. So I'll see if I can figure that out before we're done. As I was mentioning about Jackie, she's featured in chapter, 23. It would be chapter 30, page 231 of the book. And the title of that chapter is The Big Ditch. When I went down to Dublin, Georgia a few years ago, Jackie and I just had a wonderful experience, a wonderful day exploring the cemeteries where our ancestors are laid to rest. So I'm looking forward to her. I'm not sure I'm getting that delay. I apologize for that. I'll see if I can figure this out. We were going to have another cousin of mine, Emily Triglia, who was one of the first people that I met in this. I'm going to take off my headset. It's not working for me. So I was going to start with Emily, but Emily is under the weather. She got her second dose of the COVID vaccine, and you know how that goes. Sometimes you get chills or some symptoms with that. So she was feeling a little under the weather. So she's not going to be able to join us today, but I hope she's watching. Hi, Em. Hope you're feeling better. Emily was one of the first people I met. You know, when I did my DNA test, like in 2015 or so, you get these matches back, a list of matches of people who match your DNA. And Emily was one of the first people I contacted. She was one of my higher matches. And I didn't know anything about really genetic genealogy or social media and the ways that social media is used by a lot of people to, build their family trees, do family research, and learn more about their ancestry and their heritage. But Emily was well into it then. And she introduced me to a lot of the sites or pages that are on Facebook, for instance. There's one called DNA Detectives. There's another called Foundling Finders. And so Emily really began to quickly educate me and share those sites with me and teaching me about those things. So I'll share a little bit more of that with you today too, once we get going. The other person that was invited today who just wasn't able to make it at the last minute was Heather Verner. And Heather is the executive director of the National Safe Haven Alliance. And the National Safe Haven Alliance, the mission is really to protect abandoned children and to give at-risk mothers and parents an opportunity to surrender safely their healthy infant within, depending on the state, within 30 to 90 days of birth. And they can go to any designated safe haven like a fire station or a hospital, surrender that child, no questions asked, without any prosecution or fear of prosecution. And recently in Texas, there was a bill on the House to extend that to 1 year of age. And that is, a child could be surrendered up to 1 year of age. That did not pass in Texas, but I believe the law is still 90 days here. So I was hoping that we were going to have a fun discussion with other people, and it wouldn't be just me talking to you. But be that as it may, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And if we do get Jackie to join us, or if Emily comes in, we'll welcome them at that time. So again, my name is Ron Levi. I am the author of Spitting Image. It is a foundling's memoir of faith and gratitude. It's really my story. It was many years in the making. For those of you that haven't read the book yet, I was adopted as an infant. Didn't know, of course, as a young child that I was abandoned under the circumstances of my birth. But it turns out I was abandoned at a hospital in Detroit, Saratoga Hospital, which is no longer there on Gratiot Avenue. And when I was about 10 years old, my loving mother, told me, just matter of factly, we love you so much. It doesn't really matter, but it's probably right for you to know that you were adopted. And it wasn't really a big deal for me because I felt so loved and I felt a part of my adoptive family. It didn't really matter to me whether it was an adoptive family or whether it was a biological family. I was loved and I had plenty of cousins, and I spent a lot of time over at my grandmother's house. And of course, my mom and I running all over the city all the time. It just really was never much of a thought. Then, of course, in the back of my mind, as I got older, I wondered things like, might I have a brother or sister out there somewhere in the world, someone that looks a little bit more like me? In my case, I'm not sure. I know every adoption is different, and the experience is different for every child who's adopted, as well as the parent adopting. But in my case, it involved some conscious matching. Okay, so my adoptive parents were asked to bring pictures of themselves and their family to the adoption agency, which I believe was Lutheran Social Services at the time, back in the 1960s. And the Lutheran Social Services used those pictures to kind of find a child that might fit in, appearance-wise, physically or racially, right? So my adoptive family are all light-skinned African-American people, different shades of brown, some lighter, some darker, but for the most part, they all look a lot like me, or I looked a lot like them, as the case may be. And they decided that I might be a fit. It wasn't until much later that I found out a secret, which I won't give away to you now, but in the book, there was an interesting turn of events that I didn't find out until recently, like about 5 years ago, after I discovered all the DNA stuff. And I'll leave you to discover that in the book, but it was an interesting twist. So where to begin? I think what I want to do is read to you a passage from the book from chapter 30, when I talked about Jackie, who's going to join us later. I'd hope to really begin reading this when Jackie joined, but I'm going to go ahead and read it now, and then we'll let her speak to it if she's able to join us a little bit later. Okay. So on the trip to Dublin back in 2017 or 2017 when I first went there to find my roots and to meet my cousins that I'd never met before, and we'll circle back to how I actually found that family. But I caught up with cousin Jackie, who took me to see the Big Ditch. Jackie's maternal great-grandparents, William and Amelia, are my great-grandparents. In addition to Lothers, her mother family also includes Kimbers and Rosiers, to whom I'm not genetically related. Compared to the Lawrence Hill Cemetery, the ditch, as it was called, is well maintained. In fact, if the names were at all representative of the conditions, they would be swapped. Lawrence Hill Cemetery looks like a ditch, and the Big Ditch looks like a cemetery. The grass is trimmed, and the stones are all visible and legible. I have inscriptions for Jackie's great-grandfather, Thomas Loyal Lother, my grandmother's youngest brother. His wife, Amanda Kimbers, is nearby, as are several Rosiers, ancestors of Thomas Jr.'s wife, Ruby. The stones are in remarkable condition considering the dates of death. I consider the possibility that the stones were erected years after the interments. If Mandy Hall's stone was truly placed in 1932, then surely my great-grandmother Amelia had one when she passed in 1952. This was a stone we've been searching for. We haven't been able to find great-grandmother Amelia's resting place since she was buried in 1952. She passed away in Detroit, and she was returned to be buried with her husband William in Dublin, but we have not been able to find that stone. So I can only assume that there must have been one in 1952, and we're still looking for that. So with all the talk these days of preserving monuments of the past, and headstones and other grave markers are really among the most valuable and rare for genealogists. Jackie and I swept dirt away from the stones and tidied the graves of our relatives as we walked and got acquainted with one another on that glorious summer day. I looked uphill over my left shoulder, where I saw many more graves that were more prominently placed in front of and higher than those we tended. "What's that?" I asked Jackie, pointing to the rows of erect headstones. "That's the Stanley Cemetery, for the white folks," she answered. A cemetery within a cemetery, I pondered. The graves of the slaves and their descendants were not so much hidden from the Stanley plots as subordinately oriented. As we walked up the hill toward the Stanleys, Jackie explained how our family now owned the surrounding land. The birds sang and the sun warmed our faces as we recognized the unspoken irony. In a manner of speaking, we now owned the people who once owned us. I came upon a large stone expertly engraved with a name I recognized: Major A. Stanley Sr., Company A, 3rd Georgia Regiment, CSA, June 30, 1830 to March 14th, 1893. Where have I seen that name? I pulled out my iPhone, opened up the Ancestry app, and typed in the name. Whoa, Rollin was the husband of Martha Rebecca Lowther, my second great aunt. Martha is the white half-sister of my black or mulatto great-grandfather, William Lowther, and she's the daughter of my white second great-grandfather, John Lowther, who's buried in Dublin. There she was, lying next to her husband in a place called The Ditch. As I walked along the rows of stones, I recognized so many of the names. When I entered the cemetery, I thought only of my relation to the descendants of the enslaved ancestors. As we left, I read the sign that I had overlooked on the way in. Stanley Cemetery, also known as The Ditch, was begun by James Stanley II, born January 23rd, 1771, and his wife Leah Fordham, born September 6, 1771, who came to Lawrence County, Georgia from Jones County, North Carolina, about 1811. This is one of the oldest private cemeteries in the state still in use. Here sleep 6 or more generations of kith and kin, the slaves and their descendants in an adjoining plot. The interesting thing about that was, as I explored that cemetery with Jackie, it was just a beautiful day and we had really a wonderful time. It's ironic because one might not think of a cemetery in that way. You don't normally think of going to a cemetery to have an enjoyable, peaceful, fun day, but it really was. It was nice getting to know her. We had some great conversation about, our backgrounds and our history. It was really the first time we'd ever met one another. And it seemed like we had known one another forever. But the interesting thing is that just about every person in that cemetery was related to us, either a descendant of the owners of slaves or the slaves themselves, or in my case, in Jackie's case, both. So we were related. Everybody in that cemetery. It was really an unusual experience. So how did I, born in Detroit in 1964, adopted into a loving, if imperfect, family, find myself in Dublin, Georgia in 2017? I grew up, as I said, probably, in an average, working class, middle class Black family. I went to private schools for the most part, Catholic schools. I went to St. Cecilia in Detroit, and I went to Roper School out in Bloomfield Hills, which is a private suburban school. But then I finished at the University of Detroit Jesuit High School in Detroit. So a lot of my time was spent in Detroit. But it really wasn't until probably, high school, or shortly after high school, that my father began collecting information and researching his family history and family tree. And so I suppose I caught the bug from him. He would, have pictures that he would frame and put in our home. And I'd look at those and wonder, if I was related to these people or if he was related to them and how. We didn't talk a lot about it. But I think that's probably where I caught the bug. And I believe he got a book from one of our cousins, Edgar Leroy Clemens. And Edgar had done a lot of great research. And I think Edgar was a lot more versed in it than my dad was. It was just another book for my dad. But because Edgar knew the people and did the research, I'm sure it was much more personal to him. And that's kind of what it became for me. So Edgar was really, Leroy, as we call him, was really my inspiration and the first person that got me interested in genealogy and family history and research. So, the first thing I did was build on what Edgar had already laid down. He'd already done a lot of research, going pretty much to the 1830s, which is about as far as we could go on the Levi side. And I built on that by doing more research on those branches that I could. So for instance, one of the branches of the Levi's is a Gould and Pierce branch. And there is a book called Gouldtown, a very remarkable settlement, and by Theophilus Gould, I believe is his name. And it's a great book, and it really tells the story of Elizabeth Fenwick, who came over from England, and I think it was 1675 aboard the Griffin. And she came with her grandfather, and in his will, he refused to leave her any land unless she cut off relations with the person he called in his will that Black. So she was with a Black man named Gould, or Abijah Gould is, I believe, his name. And her grandfather would not leave her any any land unless she cut that relationship off. And then a few days after his death, she married a gentleman out of convenience so that she could secure that land. And then she began having children with Abijah Gould. And so the Goulds then married the Pierces. And this was, hundreds of years of intermarriage and keeping themselves in a very close and tight-knit community, probably for safety and security reasons. And who knows what else, but the features are very similar. The skin tone's very similar. Some did move out and marry, white men and women and moved away from the community and blended in, or what do we call it, passed and became white. Others did marry darker African Americans and also left the community. But the ones that stayed, there was this unique peer pressure that went on, keeping these people light-skinned for literally hundreds of years. And if you were to go to that part of Cumberland County in New Jersey today, many of them still live there. And we're spread out all over the place. I mean, we're in Michigan now, we're in California, we're probably in just about every state. That's what I learned of my adoptive family. I learned about the first person, the furthest back we could go was John Wesley Levi. And we know that John Wesley Levi left Maryland or Virginia and arrived in Ontario, Canada about